And welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co host, Ray Smith. Good afternoon, Ray.
Hi, Keith. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. We've got a special guest with us today, so why don't you introduce him?
We do. We've got Tom Kunkle with us today, and Tom and I have been exchanging emails since we met in a conversation with Alan Carr who's the historian for the Los Alamos National Laboratory. And Tom sent me a document that he has prepared that is just very exciting to me about German uranium and other things that he has learned about the Nazi programs. And I asked him if he would mind coming on and being with us here on Hidden History, and he graciously agreed to do that. Now, Tom, I know that is not an adequate introduction, so please tell the audience what you want them to know about you, and then we'll go into your presentation. Okay, so give a better introduction than what I've done.
Why, thank you, Ray. As Ray mentioned, we had got to know each other by email exchanges a year or two ago now in our joint history interests. And my history interest in retirement, which I'll tell you about in a minute, has to do with uranium. It's a narrow subject about specifically uranium and the Nazi atomic energy research program. As I got interested in this as a retirement hobby, is for my career, I worked at Los Alamos Laboratory for 42 years, I think it was. And we worked in underground nuclear weapon testing, testing of nuclear weapon systems, and foreign intelligence programs. So on leaving the lab 8 years ago, it's hard to put all that aside. I'm still exercising my interest in these, and the particular interest that I got interested in, as I say, and I will be discussing today, is the wartime uranium program in Germany. And this is a little different than most people's interest in the program, so I'm hoping this sparks some interest, but well, I'm not sure if it really will or not. I have numerous slides to put into this. I always have too many slides for the time available, but I'll go through them rapidly. It'll be a pretty rapid-paced presentation. I'll probably be spending less than a minute on each of these slides. They're pretty dense with words. I'm just going to paraphrase some of the words. Perhaps these are more memory aids than slides for the audience, but perhaps we can both, myself and the audience, find these useful. I want to apologize. Is one of my big interests and big concerns in doing historical research is to provide documentation. I see many claims made in books, journals, publications that just aren't suitably documented. For today's presentations, the materials I'm going to be showing you, it's necessary to be brief, to abbreviate many things, so there really wasn't space to put in the documentation. But these claims are all backed up as I have produced a long document. It grows longer with every day, which is largely devoted to documentation. Ray had mentioned Alan Carr, the current Los Alamos senior historian. When I get together with Alan and other of the historians group, we have several lunchtime working groups. Most common topic of discussion is not history itself, but documents. How do you know what you're talking about? And so this presentation is going to lean heavily on basic documentation. It's not going to be much into analysis. There's not going to be anything particular about the German atomic energy research program itself. But I want to emphasize the slides you'll be seeing. It wasn't possible to put the documents, the references in. They are referenced, and we can supply you with those references. So with that, I want to open up the presentation and just tell you how I came to have this interest and where it's taken us. I'm going to have time to only go into the briefest of coverage of this total stuff, the scope of the program. That I then want to pick out some particular things of interest that caught my fancy that I learned along the way, share them with you. So I'm going to open up the presentation now.
All right, go ahead. And by the way, I've been reading some of your 300 plus pages that you sent me. I haven't gotten through them all yet, but I've read some of it. So go ahead with your presentation.
Well, this is a presentation I'm working on, which I call Balancing the Books on Nazi Uranium, the Business of Uranium in the Third Reich. And I want to point out that this is just a retirement hobby. There's no institutional sponsor. There's no peer review, although the peer review I've got from researchers like Ray and others has been marvelous, and I do incorporate that in. But as a caveat to start with, I want to point out I am not a historian. I'm an astronomer. History is not my business. I'm unfamiliar with some of the protocols. So if I've made errors along the way in either my judgments or my presentations, I apologize, but those errors are entirely my own. They don't reflect at all on anyone else who have asked this about this. I say I'm going to be looking at the business of uranium at the Third Reich. What I want to do, the vision of this, is I've read many books and articles, publications, reports about wartime atomic energy research in Germany. But I couldn't find anything that really accounted for one of my interests, which is in order to build nuclear weapons, you got to have uranium. And whether you enrich it for use in an atomic bomb or you transmute it into plutonium, as it's been said, no large-scale effort on atomic weapons is possible without adequate supplies of uranium, much in excess of normal industrial requirements. Now, during World War II, the Allied powers were very much tied into this concept, made concerted efforts to determine if Germany was acquiring excess amounts of uranium, and at the end of the war to locate and recover the uranium materials. But despite the very many books and publications, I couldn't find any document that actually dealt with how much uranium the Germans had, what did they do with it, and what became of it. This is called a nuclear material inventory program. We'd like to know what nuclear materials are in use. The IAEA is now covering this in all nuclear states with very careful bookkeeping counting of the flow of uranium around the programs to make sure it's not being diverted into a weapon program. It was my ambition to try to do a similar program for wartime Germany, to once again follow the flow of uranium. Where did it go? Was any used for an actual weapon program? So this study of wartime Germany atomic energy program differs from others than almost all you've seen. I'm going to focus on the business of uranium and rather than the science and technology. So what you're going to be seeing here is a study of the businesses, contracts, association between industry and the German government, military, and the atomic energy research establishments. Just to give you the bottom line up front, there are reliable records now available. And I say now available, these are records that were not available 80 years ago and more, that have become available in the time since, declassified documents mostly, but other just industrial sheets that have been placed in archives and analyzed. The German atomic energy program had access to 754 atomic tons of uranium. What do I mean by atomic tons? That's a ton of uranium atoms. And I'll be talking about this a little more. There's several ways to talk about the mass of uranium or a uranium product or uranium or a uranium compound. But finally it comes down, we're trying to follow the uranium atoms themselves. So a lot of what we'll be talking about is going to be this notion of atomic tons, which includes tons of uranium. Now, a lot of the 754 atomic tons was in the form of raw ores that hadn't yet been processed, but they had 343 tons of refined uranium products. I'll be showing you what those are, but I'm talking now about the uranium oxides of various sorts. About 36 atomic tons of uranium came from Czechoslovakia. They were refined and purified for use in the well-known atomic energy research projects. You may have well been familiar with the ongoing work from Tim Kuff and Mimi Hebert following the uranium metal in Germany. Well, it seems that all of that metal came from the Czechoslovakian ores. We're not absolute sure of that, but of the several of the cubes, uranium metal cubes so far analyzed, those are all coming from the Czechoslovakian ore. Most of the refined uranium in wartime Germany, about 307 atomic tons, was produced during the war by plants in Belgium under contract to the Reich using African ores already in Europe at the start of hostilities. We'll be discussing that in some detail. Well, at war's end, flash forward to May 1945, you can account for all 754 atomic tons of uranium. Now, accounting in this case is a bookkeeping notion. So there's a difference between bookkeeping and what's actually there. It's a bit like looking into a family affairs problems, closing out business on a death or something. First, you find out how much money ought to be there, and then you see if you can find it all. So the records indicate that all of the uranium could be found, but not all of it could be found. I mean, could be accounted for, but not all of it could be found. But the importance of that is that we can conclude with moderate confidence that there was no significant production of highly enriched uranium or plutonium and whatnot to Germany, and thus there was no German atomic bomb. The caveat in this, we'll discuss subsequently. I say moderate confidence because there are still ways that perhaps things might have happened. Although all of the uranium could be accounted for, we can't find it all. In particular, there's 153 tons of refined uranium products that were not taken by either the Alamos mission or the Soviet atomic search teams, and these materials remain missing today. Just to continue, a few of the interesting historical features. In April of 1945, Major General Leslie Groves, the military chief of the Manhattan Engineering District, told General George Marshall and Secretary of War Stimson that the bulk of the uranium in Europe had been found and confiscated, and there was no possibility of a German atomic bomb. In reality, Alamos at that time found only half of the German uranium, and that was the half in storage rather than the half in use. And puzzlingly, Groves knew this. We're going to be discussing that some more. The failure to adequately account for the German uranium stocks at the end of the war played a direct role in the subsequent failure of the U.S. Intelligence Committee to more accurately predict the date of the first Soviet nuclear test. So this lapse in accounting had real ramifications in subsequent years. The puzzling thing, at the end of the hostilities, most of the German refined uranium products, including the missing uranium, were in the possession of shipping companies. They were no longer in laboratories or production facilities or in the process of being shipped. Why these materials were being shipped and where they're going is unclear. And a puzzling thing we'll be getting into. The story of uranium in wartime Germany really doesn't fit well with the accepted narrative of World War II German atomic energy research. And just a little conclusion of my own. It seems a lot of time's been spent pondering the actions of glamorous scientists and famous political and military leaders, and too little actually considering the facts on the ground concerning Nazi uranium. I can have to go through some jargon. Any technical presentation has jargon. When you're discussing uranium, there's lots of jargon because you're rarely dealing with uranium metal. It's often you're dealing with uranium compounds. And there's several of these which we'll be discussing today. We're going to be talking about black uranium. Same thing in German. It's the U3O8 black oxide. We're going to be talking about sodium diuranate, which is SDU. It was known in the MED as soda salt. In Germany as the yellow oxide. We're also being seeing a lot of business in uranium trioxide, the UO3. This is known as the orange oxide. The ADU is going to come up, the ammonium diuranate powder, and that's commonly known today as yellow cake. But back during the wartime, the word yellow cake wasn't being used. That came along sometime in the 50s. So yellow cake is a post-World War II term. We're going to see the Germans using some chemical processes on their uranium, which involve growing crystals of the uranium nitride hexahydrate. Known here in the MED as hex, and in wartime Germany it's just uranyl nitrate. And also, although we won't discuss it today, but in passing, is the Germans did make a small amount, and I emphasize small, of the uranium tetrafluoride white salt, as it's known here in the MED. And one of the puzzling things about the German program is so little of this was made. So that's just to break down some of the terms we're beginning hearing today. Basic structure of the German uranium enterprise. This map shows the principal places where the uranium was stored and used in wartime, along with their principal suppliers, the UMHK, we're going to talk about this company next, facility in Belgium. One of the things you want to notice in this color-coded map of the occupation regions, the regions in which work on uranium done fell into the Soviet sectors. And so we the other allied countries, in particular the Alamos missions, had little opportunity to investigate many of these locations because they were taken over by the Soviets. I want to start with the production facility in Belgium, where the bulk of the uranium came from. This was UMHK, which was at the time basically the world supply of uranium. This is Union Minérale du Haut-Katanga. Haut-Katanga, Upper Katanga is a region in the Belgian Congo where the richest source of uranium on the earth is located, much richer than anything else. The Belgian firm was put together to deal with this and other minerals in Upper Katanga region. And uranium recovered from this fueled the pre-war uranium business. In fact, between UMHK and the Canadian firm Eldorado Gold Mines, the two companies divided the world markets for radium, which is why uranium was being mined at the time in a 60-40 ratio. They basically had a global monopoly. There's been lots of controversy about the Belgian company's contributions to war efforts in the continent during the wartime, and their treatment of during the colonization period of the Congo. Turns out two professional historians, Bale and Moreau, were hired to look into the actions of the company. They've put out this book shown here on the right, From the Mine to Mars, about the company and its actions. This has a very nice descriptions of the uranium program during World War II. Now, they, of course, the authors, could not make these records up themselves. And they looked through the actual company archives, which are now in the Belgian National Archives. And here's one of the few places I haven't given you a link. If you want to see just the overall listings, there is a nice website that's been provided here. So this looks like an authoritative source of what uranium was in the country in Belgium at the time of the German invasion. As I said, the African ore was the richest source of uranium and raw materials in the world. It averaged 65 to 75% U3O8, tremendous. Many other commercial ore deposits operated at no more than a few percent. So this had enabled UMHA to completely dominate the world market. By 1937, they had sufficient ore mined and stockpiled to satisfy the future radium and uranium markets for at least 30 years. They'd actually stopped refining operations, mining and refining operations in 1937, and moved their large stockpile raw materials into Belgium. And of course, it was the business policy of the company to supply its customers with refined uranium products only in the amounts needed to meet their immediate needs. That is, at the top, prior to the war, it was the policy that the private suppliers would have only a few months supply of the uranium they were using, mostly in the colored glass business on hand. Just for fun, here at the Los Alamos Historical Museum, we actually have a little sample vial of the pitch blende, as it was called at the time, the ore from the African ore. This is what it looks like on the right there. Other players in the uranium business in Germany, the commodity trading company, which was known as Rose, was a Nazi company. And by Nazi company, that's a specific meaning. Not all Germany corporations were Nazi corporations. This was an actual setup by the government, Nazi corporation, established for the purpose of purchasing raw materials in the occupied countries and for storing and selling loot, which is allocated to German civilian production. Loot turns out to be a technical term, and we use it a lot in when you think of a pirates or looting something. But loot is actually a specific technical term in this case. So they bought, financed the purchase of, and stored precious metal for the Reich Office of Precious Metals. And that included uranium, but it also included diamonds, gold, silver, platinum, rhodium, iridium, and palladium. So they controlled a lot of that missing Nazi gold you may have seen on various YouTube channels and productions about. They were owned by a overall company, the Economic Research Company, WIFO, which was then controlled by the High Command of the German Army and the Supreme Office of Production Management. It turns out the company that owned them owned a large salt mine in Stassfurt, Germany, where they stored all sorts of stuff. And this was one of the storage sites, the loggers, in which the Rose staffed uranium. But during July 1944, at 42, there was a change in management, and all of the stocks and assets were transferred to Speer's Ministry of Ammunitions, where it became a corporation responsible for the systematic looting of all military or economic goods in German-controlled countries. Of course, that's a direct quote out of other references. And the reorganization, Rose was transferred to the Reich Ministry of Armaments, and so worked directly for Speer's ministry. The technical work was done by our Gesellschaft. It had been reorganized, Aryanized in 1938 from the former De Gea company. And it was a German firm specializing in a large number of things, but gas mask, filter mask, mine breathing masks, submarine escape apparatus, the rare earth chemical coatings used to make fluorescent light bulbs, radioactivity and radioactive materials, that's the radium and the mesothorium that was in use in medicals at the time. They built industrial radiographic applications, radiation measurement equipment, radiation protection, radiological, biological tracers, X-ray compound agents, thorium metal for vacuum tube cathodes, high voltage neutron sources. I was surprised during this publication, researching this, to learn that the concept of a high voltage neutron source, something we call a zipper today, has been around since 1937. Just a couple of years after discovery of fusion, the concept had been commercialized, was being sold. Gas metal lanterns was one of the big portions of their business, and they made a radioactive toothpaste using thorium, which I'll show you in a minute. The firm's scientific founder was Carl Welsbach, discoverer of 4 chemical elements whose specific scientific specialties included luminescence, incandescence, and the separation and purification of rare earth elements by fractional crystallation. And this is how Auer came to be in the uranium business. They took over the techniques they were using to purify rare earth elements and used them to purify the uranium itself. The same Auer also founded a sister company, which focused primarily on rare earths and radium, but they also participated in the German uranium program. De Gaussa, as it was purchased, I'll talk about De Gaussa in just a minute, purchased the predecessor De Gea in 1934, rebranded to Auer Gesellschaft. The purchase was done under duress. The owner of De Gea, Capel by name, was Jewish, and of course during the Aryanization process, all Jewish assets were in essence seized and sold at rock bottom prices to non-Jewish entities. In this case, De Gaussa bought De Gea. De Gaussa is a large chemical firm with many established subsidiaries, 23 subsidiaries, and many talk about them next. They had extensive experience in the production of metals and was an established partner of De Gea in the production of thorium. So even before the war, before uranium itself was a thing, De Gea and De Gaussa were working together to produce thorium metal. And so there was an industrial base already in place to be expanded into the uranium business. Auer Gesellschaft became the largest of the 23 De Gaussa enterprises, and it had over 10,000 people working for it as of 10th September 1944. So quite large industrial concern. Here are some of the Auer products. During the 1920s into the 1930s, they had a near monopoly on light bulbs in Europe through their Osram subsidiary. So they had the monopoly on light bulbs, fluorescent bulbs, incandescent bulbs. They made a lot of gas masks. In fact, their most profitable business product was the gas mask business. The other rare earths being a very small fraction of their business. And of course, the infamous radioactive toothpaste they made, the Dorman toothpaste, which contained thorium in it. Why this was thought to be a good thing puzzles the modern audience, but at the time it seemed reasonable. And of course, this would then subsequently cause the Alsos missions, the Manhattan Engineer District Foreign Intelligence Service missions to Germany, some concern about the large stockpiles of thorium at the plant, but well, it was just thorium for toothpaste. Continuing on with our Gesellschaft, soon after the start of the war, the weapon office of the Wehrmacht requested our Gesellschaft with help with the processing of uranium, and development began at the existing Outerwerke Plant 1, the rare earths complex in Rheinberg, town about 35 kilometers north of central Berlin, of a refining plant for the production of high purity uranium oxides from the Czechoslovakian ores. Nicholas Riel, the head of our scientific operations, who had obtained a doctorate in nuclear chemistry at Otto Hahn Institute of Berlin, with Lisa Meitner supervising his research, was placed in charge of uranium production. So Nicholas Riel is a famous person. We're going to get getting back to him in a minute. The capacity of our purification operation, however, was small. It was about 1 ton of U3O8 per month. 1 ton of uranium of the black oxide U3O8 being purified and produced. Just for comparison, at this time, the Manhattan Engineer District was producing about 100 tons per month. So this operation was producing about 1% of what the Manhattan Engineer District feed materials program was producing. Production was small. There was a foreman and 5 workmen. So 6 people are working on their uranium production process. I'm beginning to give you notice that this was a small scale effort and no way comparable to the Manhattan Engineer District or any other known nuclear weapon program. They did this by a very odd method, chemically very odd and unique to them. They first made a cellulose oxide, just dissolution the uranium oxide gold, that's sodium diuranate, SDU, and hydrochloric acid, followed by acid precipitation, which was then washed, dried, and burned in a muffled furnace. Then the second step involved the conversion of this, what they called saleable oxide, to uranyl nitrate by repeated crystallization. And the picture with all those uranium compounds, I'm showing you those beautiful pictures of uranium, ammonium diuranate, and that's what they grew. They grew these things, and that's how they purified their uranium. Now, no one else has ever done this that I'm aware of. This is unique to the wartime German program. We in the Manhattan Engineer District are using an ether extraction process on an industrial scale. The Germans were aware of their ether reduction process, extraction process. In fact, they used that process to establish the quality of the material being produced by this fraction repetitive crystallization process. So it's one of those lingering questions is, why didn't they just build a proper ether extraction plant and do it that way? Sort of puzzling. But after that, the ADU is ignited. Once again, some oxygen was added to make the U3O8 black oxide. We have some fairly detailed, in fact, they are detailed, not fairly detailed, chemical analysis of these black oxides as it was produced. This was being followed closely by the scientists to look for the amount of impurities in the material. And in point of fact, it was largely unsuccessful. There was actually little difference between the saleable oxide and the purified oxide produced in this process. And by the Manhattan Engineering District standards, this material would have been unsuitable. It would not have met high purity standards by over an order of magnitude. So one of the puzzling things here is the very poor quality of the uranium oxides being produced in this program. During the war, the rare earths plant, the Gesellschaft rare earths plant, processed uranium compounds. They also continued to produce radium for luminous paints. Luminous paints for aircraft cockpits and such were very big and necessary wartime business. They finished the uranium castings produced by the Degaussy uranium metal foundry. Talk about that in a minute. And they then continued processing thorium compounds and thorium metals for use in vacuum tubes. An unpleasant fact is convict labor was used in the Auer plants. The 6 satellite camps were eventually built to house prisoners working in the Auer enterprises. In July 1943, the Sachsenhausen Oranienburg plant next to the Auer Work 1 housed about 1,800 prisoners. In April 44, the Auer workforce in Oranienburg had included 1,650 prisoner laborers. July 44, 2,000 women and prisoners were brought in from Ravensbrück camp to work in the Auer facilities. For the purpose of the history of my accounting of Russian, this is an important fact, because the puzzling thing is so little records exist from the wartime activities of our record number one, the rare earths plant in Oranienburg. Now, many records were destroyed in the massive Allied bombings of this that were actually ordered by General Marshall, it turns out, that happened in the spring of 1945. It's widely reported that General Groves had requested the bombing of this plant, but no, in point of fact, General Marshall requested the bombing of the plant, and he told Groves to have it done. Interesting historic tidbit. The records were lost, but there's been little post-war talk about this. Nicholas Riel has written books about his experience before his death. He was taken to Russia, and he wrote a book about his experiences in Russia. He's been interviewed many times about this. But in point of fact, he had almost nothing to say about the wartime operations of the rare earths plant of Oranienburg. While we don't know, one can speculate that as an hour executive supervising the use of prison labor and hazardous conditions, he didn't have much to say about it. It turns out there's been no serious study done of the wartime hour enterprise in general. That several historians have pointed this out. That, in point of fact, is not much have been done about the industrial activities here at Hour. By the way, the uranium ore coming from the Czech plants you installed required different chemical treatments than the African ores processed from Belgium. They're quite different treatment processes. So the two plants, the plant in Oranienburg and the plant in Belgium, were not interchangeable. You couldn't take the ore from one and run it through the other. Available records indicate that little or no of the African ore was processed at our sister company in Austria. Just a picture of the production staff at Hour, and awaiting an address by Nicholas Riel in 1943. Another big player in the program was Degausse, the German gold and silver refinery. This was the parent company for Hour, so Degausse owned Hour. Degausse, I'll just read you this quote I found to succinctly describe it. Employed a virtual monopoly in a large number of fields, that attained its position by patenting the results of successful research work carried out in its laboratories, by absorption of actual and potential competitors, and by setting up cartels over which had complete control. There was hardly an industry in Germany that was not completely dependent on Degausse for some essential chemical product in which Degausse held a monopoly or quasi-monopoly. So it was a monster. The actions of the company business of Degausse during the Third Reich has been, well, it's been 20 years ago now, not recently, has been investigated by the eminent historian Peter Hayes, whom I found out after reading the book really can be described as eminent. This is a study of Degausse in the Third Reich. It's entitled From Cooperation to Complicity. And that pretty well sums up a lot of German businesses during World War II. You had to cooperate with Nazis, but it was difficult not to become complicit. What do we mean by complicit? Well, it was Degausse's, the subsidiary, the German Society for Pest Control, which produced the trademark hydrocyanic acid vaporizing pesticide Zyklon B. It was also Degausse, the gold and silver refinery, that melted down the metals, the precious metals seized from the death camps. Those are the principal players in the story. There's many more minor players, which we're not going to discuss today. But based on the available records, and the records are excellent, at the time of the German invasion of Belgium in May 1940s, UMHK had European stocks of 2440 tons of African crude concentrates. That's what they called the ores they brought in from Belgian Congo, containing 809 tons of equivalent of U3O8. Now I've got to introduce a new measurement scheme here. In the uranium business, it seems to be commonplace to value uranium, raw uranium, in tons U3O8 equivalent. So it's a different way of counting the atoms in the molecules of this. So this is a separate unit here now, tons equivalent U3O8. So those are different than atomic tons by about 74%. They had about 40 tons of finished products, that is the U3O8 and ADU, containing about 35 tons equivalent of U3O. And from that ratio, you can figure out they had about 28 tons of the yellow oxide, the SDU, soda salt as we call it, and 11 tons of the black oxide. These are indeed the two products that come out of the purification process that the UMHK used at its plants in Belgium. UMHK African ore stockpiles that had been sent to Le Havre for shipment to New York was seized in June 1940 by the invading German army. The backstory here, as the war was beginning to break out. Remember, the war had started on the 1st September 1939 with what was called the Phony War, because actually fighting didn't really begin until April 1940. So prior to that, it was clear to some of the management at UMHK that for either financial or national security reasons, they might want to get this material out of France. So they had managed to ship some to the United States, where it was eventually noticed and bought by the Manhattan Engineering District. They were in process of shipping more, but it didn't make it out of France, and that was found by the German army. The total amount of uranium in the European inventory was 717 atomic tons. That's more or less known to the kilogram. So this is a very exactly known number. At the start of the war, they had 28 tons of yellow oxide, 3 tons of the black oxide at the ETC plant. ETC is one of their two treatment plants, as they call them, or refineries, where the raw ore would be reduced to refined uranium oxides, uranium products and mussels. And there was 8 tons of black oxide in France. This had been sent there for use by the Jeumont Company, which was the private company behind the French atomic energy research. So the French had managed to buy some of this Belgian uranium and send it into France. We're going to see some of that still missing. In September 42, the remaining 1,171 tons of the African ore in Belgium, the other 369 tons had already been processed into 147 tons of finished products and sent to Germany by then. They were requisitioned by the German military, purchased by Rose, and largely moved to Germany. They were moved to that lager in Stassfurt, Germany. Excellent records again on yearly production of refined uranium plant products at the 2 uranium refinery plants. So these 2 plants were in operation at almost overlapping times. There first was the ETC and the SGMH. I won't try to pronounce the French acronyms here, the actual words for them. But this is just a table that comes from Brion and Marot, and they're pointing at how much refined oxides in tons equivalent U3O8 were being produced in each of these years. I like to point out that these are giving the amasses to the nearest kilogram. Once again, these are very well known, very well established, defensible numbers. You can make up a little graph of what it looked like. So this graph, our first graph here, is just showing the years going by. It's starting at the basically 1st of January 1940, going off to the 1st of January 1945. There's a blue box and a yellow box. The blue box is materials being refined at ETC. Due to some wartime management decisions, ETC was replaced by SMGH in about February, March 1943. After that, things were being done at SMGH. So the blue dots are the production numbers we just saw from records available in the Belgian National Archives. They look good, but it's always good to double check numbers. And so it's possible to double check these numbers. And one thing that can be done is you look at the ore consumed, the kilograms of ore consumed, knowing how much uranium it had in it, work out the equivalent amount of U3O8 equivalent, comparison with things. That looks pretty good. Then there were the deliveries to Germany. We have bookkeeping on how much of this was actually being delivered into Germany. Those are the yellow dots. So during this time, these years, 5 years here, is there was almost a constant production of your refined uranium oxides, which were being delivered into Germany soon after they were produced. There's one other thing in here, which we're going to be discussing later. It's that dashed line running up and down. That's 6 June 1942. That's the date of the meeting between Speer and the German scientist about the possibility of continuing the German atomic energy research program. It's widely said that a decision was made at this meeting to discontinue work in the German atomic energy research program. Whatever decision was made at that meeting did not affect the production and delivery of uranium into the Reich. It had no effect on the production and delivery of uranium. We're going to discuss that a bit more, the circumstances. We've been looking at the oxides. Once the oxides were sent into Germany. Yes.
Let me interrupt just a second. You've got a lot of good information coming here, and we really do appreciate it. We may need to bring you back on to finish it up. I don't know how much more you have, but we're running.
Oh, we're about halfway through.
Okay. Well, let's do this. Let's try to schedule a time for you to come back and do the remainder of the program.
Well,
that way we won't run over much.
We're going to reach a sort of natural
Okay.
break point here in just a little bit. So if we
All
can
right.
continue just with a bit. As you know, we just looked at the rate at which refined uranium was being delivered into Germany. And we do know where it was going to. It was going to some, we'll get into that a little bit more. But what was done there? Well, a little bit of it was made into uranium metal. And I emphasize a little bit. We're seeing 340 tons of uranium atoms going into Germany. We're seeing 7 tons that were made into uranium for the German nuclear weapon program, atomic energy research program. So 7 tons out of all of those 300 tons. And of course, it wasn't much of it, and it's a very poor quality. Is the uranium that was produced in the German program would not have been usable in the United States program. It's of such poor quality, the chemical analysis can still be used to establish which mine it came from. That's how poor the quality is. And so by our standards, in essence, unusable. It seems to have been little more than a science fair project, this uranium metal business. It's fascinating. And we could spend an entire episode just looking at the story at the bottom here, Germany's uranium stored at the bottom of rivers. Yeah, some of it really was flowing into a river and had to be recovered. How much, we don't know. There's no particular records, but fascinating stories. But during the war, the Germans received a whole lot of uranium, over 350 tons of it. A little of it was made into about 7 tons into the nuclear quality uranium, what they called nuclear quality, we would not, that was used in the atomic energy research programs. But what happened to the rest of it? What were they doing with it? What happened to it at the end of the year? And if this is a good time, this is a natural place to make a break here, Ray, and come back and answer that question is, what were they doing with it, and how did we find out about it, and what became of it all?
Good. I think that is a good natural stopping point, because there's some really good questions to delve into there about what happened to all of that material. And as you know, you're not the only one asking that kind of question, but I don't know that anyone has come up with good answers either. Do you?
No, that's why I started this program. And I also, on the title slide, I mentioned this was a preliminary accounting.
Yeah.
And by preliminary, I mean we're still looking for references. Just for the audience to know. Yeah. The reason I'm talking to Ray about this is, well, he's a retired historian at Oak Ridge. And I have learned that Oak Ridge has some documents I'm interested in looking at that might resolve some of these questions. So this is more of a pitch to people to help find the documents, the U.S. Alamos documents. They're in storage somewhere, and find out where those are, and let's establish what really happened during this time. It looks like it can be done. The documents are available, but we don't know where they are. So if you're interested, why I was interested in talking to Ray about that, that was my interest.
And I have taken those requests that you've made of me, and I have passed those on. I'm having some difficulty getting good responses, but you're not unused to that kind of thing, I know. So
we are constantly working with National Archives on trying to fulfill requests, documents we know they have in specific folders, and it's sometimes difficult. And I want to mean no disrespect or reflect poorly on the actions, is these archives are tremendous national resources, and they're also tremendously underfunded, is they just don't have the staff to meet with scientific researchers.
I agree and understand, and sometimes requests are not given as high a priority as some of the other work that they have to be doing, and I appreciate that. But I'm hoping that eventually we'll get the attention and get those documents that you're looking for.
It's an 80-year-old problem, so there's no rush.
I understand, and we will definitely let you finish this portion of your presentation at another time and bring you back. Okay.
Sounds great. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I hope this has been interesting for the audience.
Yeah, it has been good. Thank you.
All
Keith,
right.
we'll wrap it up there.
All right. That sounds great. Do we have anybody else slated, lined up next yet, Ray?
I do. I have Ronnie Bogard. We talked to her a long time ago about the Alvin Weinberg papers collection, and she's made a lot of progress. Those papers are online now, and she's done some research. I've actually even got her involved in doing some research for an upcoming documentary on Robert Oppenheimer, and she's found all of the correspondence between Oppenheimer and Weinberg.
Oh, wow.
And we've shared that with those folks that are making that film. So
All
I told her at that time, it's a good time for her to come on and just give our audience an update on where the Alvin Weinberg Papers project is.
All
and
right.
she'll do that for us at our next program.
All right. Very
and Tom,
good.
we'll work with you on a schedule to bring you back. It may be a few weeks. I've got a couple of things scheduled, but we'll get you back. Okay.
Sounds good. And I want to thank you again.
All right.
Yeah. Glad to have you.
Very good. All right, folks. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another Hidden History.